What if I told you one of the most famous facts about the human brain was never a scientific fact at all? You've heard it before. We only use 10% of our brains. Movies, self-help gurus, motivational speakers, even some teachers have repeated it for decades. But here's the shocking part. Not only is it false, we can actually trace how this myth was born, who helped spread it, and how science eventually exposed it. This is the 100-year story of the 10% brain myth. Our story begins in 1907 with Harvard psychologist and philosopher William James. In an essay called The Energies of Men, James argued that people often live below their full potential. He observed that when people push through their first wave of fatigue, they sometimes discover a second wind, new reserves of energy, focus, and determination. James wrote that many of us are only half awake to our true capabilities and that we often live far within our limits. But here's the crucial detail. James was talking about human effort, willpower, and psychological potential. He was not talking about unused brain cells. He never claimed that 90% of the brain sits inactive. He never said we use only 10%. Yet his idea of hidden human potential planted the seed for a misunderstanding that would grow for decades. Just 10 years later, a new 1917 edition of James's work included something fascinating. James himself complained that newspapers had misunderstood his message. He warned that journalists had twisted his ideas into sensational claims. He explained that he wasn't encouraging extreme overwork, miracle transformations, or magical hidden powers. He was simply describing the real phenomenon of pushing past initial fatigue. In other words, the original author was already trying to stop people from misinterpreting his work. But the myth had started taking on a life of its own. Then came a critical moment. In 1929, an advertisement for the Pelman Institute of America appeared in the World Almanac. The ad promised to improve people's minds through scientific mind training. And for the first time, the vague idea of untapped potential was transformed into a specific number: 10%. The advertisement claimed that people were using only a fraction of their mental powers and suggested that its course could unlock the rest. This wasn't neuroscience, it was marketing. The 10% figure sounded scientific, memorable, and persuasive. And once a myth gets a precise number attached to it, it suddenly feels like a fact. In 1936, the myth received an enormous boost. Dale Carnegie published How to Win Friends and Influence People, one of the most influential self-help books ever written. In the introduction, written by broadcaster Lowell Thomas, readers were told, Professor William James of Harvard used to say that the average man develops only 10% of his latent mental ability. There was just one problem. James never said that, not once. He never used the number 10%. He never described inactive portions of the brain. Yet, because the statement was linked to a respected Harvard psychologist, millions of readers accepted it as truth. And from that point on, the myth spread across books, magazines, classrooms, television shows, and eventually the internet. For decades, people repeated the claim without evidence. Then, in 1951, researchers Gordon Brownell and William Sweet developed some of the earliest positron detecting devices capable of studying activity inside the brain. In 1974, Michael Phelps and Edward Hoffman created the first true human PT tomograph, allowing scientists to see detailed activity throughout the living brain. By the 1980s, PET scans became powerful tools for mapping brain function. and what they revealed completely destroyed the 10% myth. PET scans work by tracking a radioactive form of glucose. Since brain cells need energy to function, active areas absorb more glucose and appear brighter on the scan. If the 10% myth were true, scientists would expect to see only a tiny portion of the brain lighting up, while the rest remain dark and inactive. That's not what happens. Instead, activity appears throughout the brain. Different regions become more or less active depending on what you're doing. But virtually all of the brain serves a purpose. Here's an even simpler reason the myth can't be true. If 90% of the brain were useless, damage to most of the brain wouldn't matter. But neurologists know the exact opposite is true. Tiny injuries to specific brain regions can dramatically affect speech, memory, movement, or personality. Every part of the brain is doing something important. The brain you're already using is the most complex object known in the universe.